Hello and welcome to the Autistic Me podcast. I am Christopher Scott Wyatt, an autistic parent to two neurodiverse young daughters. I've met dozens of autistic parents who realized they were autistic while seeking supports for their children. Many of the autistics diagnosed later in life begin their journeys of self-discovery after a child is diagnosed. Some of them have told me I was fortunate to know that I was autistic before my wife Susan and I decided to form a family. Surely, I'm an expert on how to support and nurture my daughters. No, I'm overwhelmed, insecure, and always searching for insights. I recently received a review copy of Navigating Autism, 9 Mindsets for Helping Kids on the Spectrum. I found myself nodding in agreement often, and sometimes I was left with questions. I appreciate books that make me think. It is an honor to welcome the book's authors, Professor Grandin and Dr. Debra Moore, to the Autistic Me podcast.
Great to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much for taking some time. I'd like to start right away with the overarching theme of Navigating Autism. You ask readers to focus on strengths and envision success in adulthood for autistic children. Professor Grandin, you and I have spoken about that life preparation, which you actually have a section, Mindset 6, preparing kids for the real world. Why is it so important that we think of that adulthood, that future that is going to happen for our children?
Well, what I'm saying in all the conferences I've gone to and people I've talked to is we're doing a good job in a lot of cases working with real little kids. But I'm seeing too many kids and teenagers that aren't learning basic skills. They're not learning things that I learned when I was 8 years old. Like I had a little allowance and I went in shops and I bought comics and toy airplanes. And I learned that if I wanted this little more expensive airplane, I had to save for 2 weeks. I was learning just really basic things. In our neighborhood, social skills were taught by we had sit-down meals. And if I stuck my finger in the mashed potatoes, my mother didn't scream no. She would give the instruction, use the fork. Grown-ups corrected little kids. Like if I was in the shop and I touched too much stuff, the clerk would say, only touch the things you're going to buy. And when the parents had parties, when I was like 8, I'd dress up in my best clothes, and my brother and my sisters had to do it too, and greet the guests. And I'm realizing that it's taught me really important basic social skills to help me be successful. And it was all done in a really nice way. It wasn't screaming no. It was giving the instruction. And I think this is one of the reasons why, the parents that find out they're autistic later on in life were able to get jobs and keep them. A lot of them had paper routes when they were 11. Learning how to work is a different skill than academics. You have to be on time. And I recommend to parents, kids about 11, get a volunteer job. It could be at a church. It could be at a farmer's market. But someplace where they're doing a job on a schedule where the family is not the boss. And the instant they're legal, they need to get real jobs. And we have to set them up for success. Don't put them into multitasking at McDonald's takeout window. Don't put them in the noisy, chaotic kind of place. More quieter jobs. Office supply store, that was one example of a really great success.
Dr. Moore, this tendency to shelter our children that have diagnoses, I see it often, and sometimes I'm criticized. My daughters are in Girl Scouts. They are in STEM activities. I believe next weekend the oldest is doing a STEM camp virtually. How do we convince parents that sheltering, well, it's a common instinct to shelter your child and protect your child, that in some ways keeping your child from these activities might be counterproductive?
It absolutely is counterproductive. I think when you start out advocating for a small child, you get into a rut and you get used to being the protector. And that's appropriate. Many times it's appropriate when your child's being bullied, ostracized. You've got to do that. You've got to advocate for your child. But a child changes developmentally as they grow, and you've got to change developmentally as a parent. Your role for an 8-year-old is not the same as for a 3-year-old or for a 15-year-old. And if you don't step in, your child, especially an autistic child who may have executive functioning issues, is not going to be able to do it by themselves. So the parent has got to check their anxiety at the door and Go ahead and try new things with your child. Know that you're going to get pushback, and that's just part of it. That's okay.
I want to take a step back. The first mindset mentioned in Navigating Autism is that the child is more than the autism. Dr. Grandin, you write, and you have written several times eloquently, that you want to be known as a professor of animal science. You are a professor at Colorado State University. That is your niche. That is what you want to be known for, not predominantly as autistic Temple Grandin.
Well, autism is a really important part of who I am, and it's an important part of my identity. But my career is really important, and I don't want people in teachers, educators, people on the spectrum to forget that I actually have a career. I have been at meetings where they didn't even know that I was a professor, and that I have written important animal welfare guidelines for the entire meat industry that are used around the world. I've designed equipment for major companies, and I want people to know that, because a lot of people get label locked. Now, this is Debra's term. Debra made up this term, label locking. And I'm seeing parents and even maybe individual getting so much into the label, they aren't getting out and doing things. I've worked in the cattle industry. I've also worked on construction, heavy industry. That's my background. Some of the funnest stuff I ever did was figuring out how to build stuff. I worked with super talented drafting machinery designers and people that owned welding shops and metal fabrication shops. And they were definitely autistic, undiagnosed. One guy, autistic, dyslexic, stutterer, took a single welding class in high school. He sells his equipment all around the world. And I think it's important for people to know that. 20% of the people I worked with on equipment installation were either autistic, dyslexic, or ADHD. And one guy who owns a gigantic factory. You see, and most of these people own their own businesses in this field. You know, I'm not talking about the healthcare field. I'm talking about the machinery field. Own their own businesses. That often works out better. And one guy, he owns this great big huge stainless steel factory, and he's in his 70s. I had an hour-long discussion about what his diagnosis would have been. He would have had every diagnosis in the book. And I don't want to see the kids held back. I'm seeing some parents, when I suggested their child go in the store, buy something, say that they just can't let go. And it's something innocent, like buying printer paper.
The problem is that diagnosis is a medical model, and it emphasizes deficits. And we need to step way back from that as parents and clinicians and find those strengths. Expose kids. We underestimate autistic kids way too much.
My daughter has told me she wants to be known as an artist.
Yeah.
And she has asked, will I be known for my art? And it's a valid question, because what she has already perceived at the young age of 9 is that teachers, when they look at her art, what they do is they say, oh, well, of course you have this gift. You're autistic. So somehow the autism becomes more defining than she's a very talented artist, and that's what she wants to do.
Yeah.
And so that every child is more than autism meant so much to me.
And teach her some responses, role play with her so that she can think on her feet and have a response to that teacher and educate that teacher and stand up for herself.
Now, that's an interesting phrase, standing up for yourself. Should we be teaching our young children who are autistic that they are both autistic and more? And should we be teaching 9, 10, 11-year-old autistics to self-advocate?
Absolutely. Why wouldn't we?
Dr. Grandin?
Well, the other thing is, when I was in college, I had a terrible time with math. And when I failed my first math quiz, I got help. Biggest mistake I see students make, and I'm going to not applies to students without autism too, is when they start to have a problem with the class. They don't ask for help soon enough. Another thing I want to talk about is the different kinds of minds. I am an object visualizer, an extreme visual thinker. Your daughter is probably an object visualizer, since she's good at art. Now, my kind of mind and your daughter's kind of mind probably going to be really terrible at algebra. And a lot of the machinery designers I've worked with were terrible at algebra. And I'm worried about them getting screened out. And they're building equipment for heavy industry here. You see, I'm trying to get across the silos here. Now, another kind of mind is the mathematical mind, another autistic mind. Oh, they're all over Silicon Valley. They run Silicon Valley. These are your visual spatial pattern thinkers, programmers, physicists, mathematicians. That's another kind of specialized autistic mind. And then you have your word thinker, autistic mind, and they're often very good at sales of a specialized product. For example, cars, there's been some real successes. There's been some real successes with selling exotic banking financial products, things I don't even understand. But there's been 2 very good successes at a major bank with that. And again, I'm a bottom-up thinker, so I tell you about specific examples. And there's scientific research in my book, The Autistic Brain, that these different kinds of minds exist. And I've been researching all the new literature, and it totally supports it. And so, the people I worked with on building equipment are not going to be programming computers. You see, that's a different type of autistic mind.
Do you think they would have been where they are had they been diagnosed?
Well, in my book, Different Not Less, I was the editor of a book called Different Not Less. About 18 people diagnosed later in life tell about their lives. And one of them worked for a major tech company high up. And she said, I don't know if I would have gotten to where I was if I'd known I was autistic earlier. That's the thing. I'm concerned with some of the kids with the labels holding them back. But on the other hand, what I learned as editor of Different Not Less was where the diagnosis was helpful for an older adult was with their relationships. It was almost a total relief to them.
Dr. Moore, one of the problems we run into with our daughters is comorbidity. Dr. Grandin has mentioned this as well. Often when we are diagnosed or our children are diagnosed, there are comorbid conditions. You have 2 chapters. Mindset 5 stood out to me because that was psychiatric conditions. Both of my daughters and I are diagnosed as ADHD, and that is one of the first things you mention in that mindset. Autism is often comorbid with seizure disorders, ADHD, dyslexia. Why is it important for parents to understand that totality of diagnoses instead of just focusing on the autism?
Well, if you don't see the other condition that might be associated with autism, you're not going to be able to address it. You're not going to be able to treat it. And if you don't treat it, your child is going to be emotionally dysregulated. Probably they're not going to be able to pay attention. They're not going to be able to perform academically. They're not going to be able to relax socially. It impacts every area of their life. You can take anxiety as a great example because that's common. I mean, that is just ubiquitous. It's everywhere. You can't think as well when you're anxious. That's true for everybody, autistic or not. So a lot of times kids, whether they're verbal or not, can't put it into words to tell us. So we have to be detectives. That's why we include the checklists and the questionnaires to see what else might be behind a struggle or a behavior.
Well, I got horrible anxiety when I hit puberty. Horrible. And it got worse as I went through my 20s. It was tearing my health apart with colitis. If I didn't get the colitis under control, I might have had to have surgery for it. I think some of this is a cause of autistic burnout. And I'm one of these people where a low dose of an antidepressant medication, it saved me. I don't think I'd be here today without it. And I wrote about it in my book, Thinking in Pictures. And this anxiety was strictly biology. See, this is where a little tiny bit of medicine, and I've been on it for 40 years. I don't dare stop taking it. I'm not going to do that experiment. But I did the Dipping Vat projects that were shown in the HBO movie without the medication. But I don't know if I could have become a college professor if I hadn't taken that medication. You see, this is the thing about drugs. A little bit used absolutely right. And your child's also an example of that. Oh, but there's been drug disasters too, like getting 100 pounds overweight, losing the ability to do math. There's some really bad side effects of medication. But used right, I don't think I would be here today without the medication.
I was speaking on autism and autism issues long before Susan and I became parents, and we decided to form a family. Now that I'm a parent, and I discuss the fact that my children do receive therapeutic supports, they receive medication. These were not decisions I made lightly because I know so many autistic self-advocates are against medication. They're against some therapy. My youngest was self-injurious. She was nonverbal. And for us, there's a medication she's on, risperidone, that has just changed her life. How do we explain to autistics without saying I'm not trying to change my child, and I don't want to get too defensive, but as Dr. Grandin said, without medication, she wouldn't be so happy and outgoing and successful now academically without those supports.
And I think my health would have totally deteriorated. I was being torn apart. I mean, colitis was uncontrollable. And the colitis, I still have it just slightly. 90% cured the colitis. And that's because my nervous system wasn't ramped up in total fear mode. Brain scans has since shown that my fear center in my brain was like 3 times larger than normal. And the medication stopped. It's really biology, that constant fear response. But on the other hand, I've seen medications used wrong, and there's been complete disasters. You have to be careful. You try one thing at a time, see how it works very, very carefully. And there's way too many heavy-duty meds given out to children way too casually. I'm totally against that.
I think when you have advocates who are giving you pushback, it's understandable. We've got an ugly history in the autism world, but I think that the fact is you are not trying to sedate or compromise your child. You're trying to let her be her best self. And that's what the medication does. It takes away the obstacles.
Yeah, that's correct when you use it correctly, but there is a horrible history. A new book has just come out about all the dreadful therapies being done with electric shocks and things like that. Some of the early therapies, they were driving people into sensory overload because the sensory issues weren't understood, and that was completely terrible. And when it comes to evaluating therapies for little kids, I always ask parents, is the child progressing? And I'm going to talk about its speech. Turn taking. There was a lot of emphasis in my therapy when I was a 3-year-old on learning how to wait and take turns. And things like dressing. I was taught to lay out my clothes the night before. I still lay out the shirt I'm going to wear the night before. I actually still do that. And the child should be progressing. Also, the child should like going to therapy. The child hates therapy. Something's wrong. But a good teacher, some teachers just have the ability to work with these kids. And I had excellent speech teacher and her assistant when I was a real little kid.
This is your second collaboration. In 2016, Dr. Moore and Dr. Grandin published The Loving Push, How Parents and Professionals Can Help Spectrum Kids Become Successful Adults. This new work, Navigating Autism, really comes back to that too, that successful adulthood, envisioning the future. It's easy as a parent to think about the now and what I'm doing right now to protect my child. But one of the scary realities, my child's going to become a teenager and then an adult. And both of you address this throughout Navigating Autism and the 9 mindsets you offer. All of that seems to be headed towards that future. So how do we get into a future mindset, a mindset that says my child is going to grow up?
It's easy to just put out fires when there are so many fires going on. And we have to step back and we have to get the whole team, everybody in the child's life, thinking towards the future and make it concrete. Get some of those experiences that Temple talks about started very, very early. You're going to try, if you are cognitively able, to have some kind of vocational activity when you're 18 or hopefully before that. But when you're 5, you can still start learning skills that directly apply to that. Temple did it with her allowance. That made a difference. Temple did it with learning to take turns. Those are all future oriented. So if we think about it that way, we start preparing, we start putting it in IEPs. The clinicians, the physical therapists, the occupational therapists start thinking about it from the beginning. So it's seamless. We don't have a kid turn 17 and fall off a cliff, which is what's happening to our kids. And then they're ending up in the basement playing video games, isolating, stagnating. It's got to start and become more seamless.
Well, one of the problems with the whole video game thing is they're making them more and more addictive. Silicon Valley parents don't hardly let their kids play video games. I think everybody knows that Elon Musk came out on Saturday Night Live that he was autistic. And you know what he was doing with video games? He was making them and selling them. But I looked up his age. He was just old enough to avoid the most addictive games. And he was learning work skills young. You know, little entrepreneur businesses. When my sister and I were kids, we had a disastrous Kool-Aid stand where we ran out of sugar. But when I look back on that, that's the beginning of teaching work skills. And we've got to limit the video game playing. Because what I'm seeing, there's two pathways. Where one mom comes up to me and we say, well, oh, my son is working at the ice cream shop and just loves it. And ice cream shops don't have as much multitasking. He's really blossomed. I hear that term blossomed all the time. And then another mom comes up to me really shy and she says, my son's in the bedroom playing video games and doesn't do anything else. I want to tell you about 3 successes because my mind works in individual specific cases. Auto mechanics been used in 3 separate cases of young adults addicted to video games, solely switched to auto mechanics. And because it's a visual thinkers like me, I don't play video games because what little I've played, they were drugged for me. I don't have any of that stuff on my phone. And they found that the cars are more interesting. And one of the guys now fixes trains for the railroad and he loves his job and the railroad loves him. And because it's the visual thinkers like me and the mathematicians, we're some of the worst on getting addicted to video games. And if these people were becoming video game designers or programmers, I would not be bashing it. But that's not what's happening. And the thing also with me, I spent 25 years in heavy construction. And construction is all about outcomes. I'd sell a job, design a job, do the drawings for it, supervise its construction, start it up and make it work. And these are mostly cattle handling systems. And I realized that changes how I think. It's all about outcomes in the future. That's what construction's all about. And it definitely affects my mindset.
I'd like to talk about something related both to preparing a child for adulthood. Also, it's related to anxiety and overprotecting, and that is perfectionism. A lot of folks are perfectionists who are autistic, and if we protect them from making mistakes, we're doing a grave disservice. We learn by making mistakes. We need to desensitize our kids to making a mistake so that instead of melting down, they try to find another solution.
No, that's absolutely right. And I think one of the things is even the normal kids or neurotypical, whatever you want to call them, kids have trouble with making mistakes. And I think part of the problem is schools have taken out all the hands-on classes. Like the skilled tradespeople I worked with, they were saved by a single welding class. Now, I'm not saying welding's for everybody. But what's happening in the schools is when you take out sewing, cooking, woodworking, art, music, theater, you remove opportunities for students to try on careers. And in theater, I didn't care about acting in the play, but I made costumes and scenery when I was in elementary school, high school, and even in college. But that's something that can lead to a career. And so one of the things I want to see the schools put this stuff back in. Because these hands-on classes, I learned about making mistakes. I wrecked a sewing project. I cut the fabric too quickly. You got to be more careful. I don't know what would have happened to me if my school had not had hands-on things. When I was in elementary school, woodworking, art, and sewing. Love those classes.
You mentioned the anxiety of perfectionism, and that is one of the problems my 9-year-old suffers from. It's one of my challenges. I will throw an entire page away because I did the lettering wrong. For her, it is paralyzing, and it's one of the things we're working through is, okay, let's think about this. If you do make a mistake, what will happen? What is the worst outcome that will happen? And the worst that happens is you learn from the mistake and you try not to make it again.
Yeah.
I find this so fascinating because we have actually we've never allowed a lot of screen time. We do a lot of building of things for physics. She does a lot of marble ramps or a lot of Rube Goldberg style construction.
Good.
My wife is a crafter, so we have a lot of sewing and crafting. I want my children to know if they try something and fail, mom and dad are going to sit there with them and say, okay, you tried. We need to reward trying.
Yes. Yes.
Yes, and we need to role model being okay with our own mistakes. So that sounds like that's something you're working on. I would make mistakes intentionally, small mistakes in front of my clients so they could hear me talk to myself about that.
Well, what I learned in a sewing project, in this particular case, I had to throw the project away because there was no way to get any more of the same fabric. Okay, but that's still not the end of the world. And the one thing I learned from it, be more careful and measure more carefully before you cut the fabric. That's what I learned.
I really enjoyed reading Navigating Autism. It was very approachable. It is a work a non-researcher can read, even though it has all the citations. It tells you where the data are coming from. It gives you the sources. But I want parents, and especially those like myself who are autistic, it is a very approachable book. I want them to know that. I want them to know the data are in there. And it helps. It's reassuring to know that a lot of the choices that I'm making aren't incorrect. I am thinking of my children. I tell them, we have chores now. We have tasks we need to complete. In many ways, this book is reassuring. I appreciated that it was so approachable with the checklist and the snippets out. I want to thank you for writing a book that was an easy read that was so reassuring as a parent.
That's great to hear.
Wonderful.
This is your second collaboration. I do want to ask, how does that work for you, Professor Grandin? I have a lot of difficulty with executive function, and so having a collaborator in academia often helps me. How did this collaborative process work for yourself and for Dr. Moore?
Well, for me, I have problems with organization. I've got two books where all the writing's mine, and it would be Thinking in Pictures and The Way I See It. Now, The Way I See It is just a whole lot of little short chapters. I kind of place Navigating Autism. That's a good book for new parents to read, therapists to read. Way I See It's got a lot of how-to instructions in it. But I have other books, Animals in Translation, Animals Make Us Human. I co-authored with Katherine Johnson. And I need someone on long documents to organize the writing. And I now go back to the different kinds of minds. Being a visual thinker, I'm really good at finding some really great source material that my co-writer probably wouldn't find. You see, we're using, Debra's very verbal. You see, so we're understanding, okay, Debra's verbal, I'm visual. And when you recognize those differences, we can collaborate in a really, really good way. And you know, the same thing's happening in engineering. My kind of mind that can't do algebra designs the packaging machine in a food processing plant. The degreed engineer does boilers and refrigeration because that requires mathematics. That division of labor on every project where I spent time out on the job, there was that division of labor there. And I didn't actually realize it until I actually was writing down jobs and writing down some of the people that worked on them. But I'm a specialized thinker that makes me really good at certain things. But organization of the material, I can, by the way, Betsy, my co-author now, we're working on a book on visual thinking. Oh man, what Betsy does to my stuff, my editor Becky, how they are, the way they reorder the stuff, it's just wonderful. But they need my source material. You see that, but we need the whole team. The whole team is essential for a successful project, whether it's construction or whether it's writing a book.
And Dr. Moore, what is the experience, this second collaboration? What has that been like for you?
Oh, it's an honor. Temple's right. We always do better when we collaborate with someone who thinks differently. It brings more richness to the experience. So I would probably write a book that was a little less accessible. And Temple helps me put images in there that make it more relatable and more specific examples. So we bring out the best.
Well, you see, my mind, verbal thinkers, regular neurotypical verbal think very top down. So you have a big, broad concept, like maybe inclusive education. Okay, but my kind of mind will think of specific examples of how that was achieved, where it was successful. I talked about some of the job things. I tend to give you specific examples. These are real people that I talk to. Now I can start putting them into categories. It's not that I'm absolutely saying car mechanics is the most wonderful thing, but I've talked to 3 cases where they were weaned off of video games successfully with car mechanics. 3 cases, separate cases, and I could fully understand that. And for somebody else, it might be something else. But for the visual thinkers, Auto Shop was successful 3 times. You're starting to see a trend there. You see, that's taking specific examples and putting them into like cells on a spreadsheet. I sort specific examples into categories. You see, but on implementing things, you need both. There's a problem with the broad concepts. You hear that all the time in politics. These people don't have any idea how to implement anything. They talk about, green energy or something. Well, how do you actually do this? And now I'm seeing our coal-fired power plant. I have been over there. I've watched them dump the coal in that thing. And we can't just turn that off. This computer would be off. We have to eventually phase that out. But you see, I would tend to approach it, okay, let's look at the power stations. How could we reasonably do this? You see, that's a more bottom-up approach. You see, it's nothing abstract about it. I see the power station.
What I like about what you're saying is it goes against the assumption that autistics cannot be collaborators, that we cannot be taught how to share responsibilities and share a project. As an instructor, I will receive accommodations that say, allow your autistic student to work alone. And there has to be a better approach because as you keep writing about and throughout navigating autism, you mentioned that adulthood, and your other work, successful adults. My wife has worked telecommuting for most of her 17-year career as an engineer and technical communicator, but she collaborates. Writing and designing are collaborative efforts. So I worry that when we say to educators, oh, we'll let the autistic child or the ADHD child work alone, that's not preparing for the future.
Okay, let me tell you how I collaborate. Whether it's a physical equipment design job or a writing job. I've written a lot of animal welfare guidelines. There's guidelines for the American Veterinary Medical Association. I've written parts of that. And what I did is I sat in a committee meeting. I want a piece of that project, well-defined piece of the project that I will write, covering a certain subject. I don't like a vague thing. I like to have a piece of homework that's mine. And it's due on a certain date. References have to be in a certain format where there's like a clearly defined part of this project. When I did machinery, there was a certain point on the rail in the plant where my responsibility stopped. There's a certain switch up there on the rail. And when the process got to that switch, another engineer was responsible for it. There was clear boundaries of where I have a piece of it. And now I still had to collaborate because we had to get people to build stuff. I had electrical and plumbing on my stuff, which somebody else was going to do. But a clear boundary and instructions of what my piece of the project was. And I always would, in initial project meeting, say, okay, now this is what I will do. The whole cattle handling system up through stunning, up to this one switch. And then we got to look at the property line, the railroad setbacks, check the as-built drawings, see if they're accurate. People don't bother to do that. But it's the same approach of having a clear thing that I do. And when I do academic collaboration, I want it very clear. You want a book chapter on cattle handling? How long? What do you want it to cover? Clear directions on what the outcome of the project is.
We have an example in the book that would be useful for teachers, how to structure groups in the classroom and to include an autistic child in that group, and how to define tasks and what kind of outcome you could expect.
Well, the other problem we got with autism I want to mention is you're going all the way from Elon Musk to somebody who remains nonverbal, that cannot dress themselves, and may have uncontrollable epilepsy. And they're all under the same name. Now, as a visual thinker, I have problems with that. If somebody's diagnosed with ADHD or dyslexia, that's much narrower. Reading problems or sort of attention and distractibility.
I think it's important that we do remember it's on a spectrum, and that's also why the individualized education plans need to be individualized. And we really need to look at how to incorporate that student successfully into the classroom so that student isn't like my poor daughter who was moved to the wiggle table. So she's in the classroom but not integrated into the classroom. As Dr. Grandin just mentioned, my wife, part of what she does as a technical communicator is assign out small bits and pieces to other people.
Yes.
So it's collaboration, but it's not the way people think of brainstorming sessions where everybody's talking at once. That would be horrible for both of us.
No, I have whether it's construction project or a writing project, well defined on what my part of the task is. And I used to work for a magazine, so I'm used to deadlines.
I write for a monthly magazine column, and that monthly deadline, here's what we need from you. It needs to be this many words submitted on this date.
Yeah, that's right.
I do great. If I'm in the meeting where it's 20 people talking about I don't understand why we do it.
Well, there's some talking you have to do because I have been on brainstorming meetings where we've got an equipment problem. We got the plant down right now, and we've got a real mess. And you can have a meeting where everybody is talking, and then you have a really good troubleshooting meeting where you've got a moderator in there, if it's a really good manager, getting the ideas from other people, and then all of a sudden go, now, this is what we're going to do. I've been in the very best troubleshooting meetings, and I've been ones that have been total mess to them. Plant was a mess. Bad management been there.
I really appreciate the two of you taking your time so generously to be on the Autistic Me podcast. I want to thank Temple Grandin for just offering her insights and for being Temple Grandin. There's really nothing to say. We've only met a couple of times, and I'm sure you don't remember, but you have spoken at Autism Society of America events.
Yeah.
You have been on panels with Stephen Shore, Lars Perner. When we are out there, parents think of us as somehow the epitome of autism, and often it falls on us to say, no, there is a spectrum. Your child is not going to be me. And I appreciate so much that you do that.
Well, I've been out to Silicon Valley, and there's a lot of programmers out there that I know are undiagnosed, and where some of those programmers can be really helped by a diagnosis with their relationships. That's where it can be really helpful for an older person. But I'm concerned about too many kids being held back. You got fully verbal kids never shopped, never handled money. I wish I didn't have to talk about shopping. I actually find it rather boring to talk about it. But I'm finding that I have to talk about it. It's something that I just learned as a kid along with all the other kids in the neighborhood. And then when we went to the store, if we touched too many things, the clerks would go, only touch the things you're going to buy. They didn't scream at you. They just told you quietly, if you touch the things you're going to touch have to be things you really think you might buy. They would give the instruction. And that was 50s, what I call teachable moments. It was all done very calmly. There was no screaming or yelling or anything like that.
Dr. Moore, your work has covered internet addiction and now preparing for successful futures. I appreciate having your voice on podcast, and I appreciate the reassurance that we are doing the right thing by preparing for the future, not insulating and protecting our child. So I really appreciate your voice and perspective too. Thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you for having us on here.
No, I think it's been really good, and I think it's been a really good collaboration because Debra and I approach it from different ways, and that's the way to do it. You need all the different kinds of minds on the team.
Well, thank you very much to our listeners of the Autistic Me podcast. I hope everyone has enjoyed this, and you can find Navigating Autism 9 Mindsets at the W.W. Norton website, on Amazon, at Barnes & Noble, and anywhere books are available. Thank you both.
Thank you.